Welcome to Themis Podcasts. Themis is an award-winning platform that helps our clients and community manage their financial crime risk exposure. We aim to democratise due diligence through our AI-powered AML and KYC platform, our expert research and insight into emerging financial crime threats, and our deep dive intelligence for enhanced due diligence. Find out more at wearethemis.com.
Hello and welcome to Themis Podcasts, where we have a special episode ahead as we delve into the report that Themis and WWF have recently published, Financial Crimes and Land Conversion, Uncovering the Risk for Financial Institutions. I'm Aine McParland, an environmental and financial crime researcher at Themis, and will be moderating this discussion. Joining us today, we have Olivia Dakeyne, Associate Director of Insight at Themis, and John Dodsworth, Drivers Initiative Lead at WWF-UK, to talk to us about the report. Olivia is a financial and environmental crime researcher with over 13 years of experience in various roles across the public and private sectors, including in research, finance, sustainability, policy and strategy for organisations like the Natural History Museum, Kew Gardens and Klein Earth. Olivia leads on human and wildlife trafficking and other environmental crime projects, particularly through the lens of serious organised transnational crime. Our second guest is John, who is the Drivers Initiative Lead as part of WWF UK's Conservation Programmes team. His areas of work include commodities supply chains, drivers of deforestation, and addressing environmental crime across Asia, Pacific, and Africa. Before joining WWF, John worked in the maritime sector and assessed sanction and illicit financial flow risk. John and Olivia and I have worked closely together on this report, and I'm thrilled to have them here today to discuss the interesting content and findings. So without further ado, let's get started. So moving to our first question, John, can you start off by giving us some insight into the broader context of this project? We're interested in understanding where the report sits within that context, how it came to be, and what it aims to achieve.
Thanks very much, Anya. So it's a really good question. And where we started with the work on the Environmental Crime Financial Toolkit was back in 2020 through a piece of work that was undertaken by the UK government and also with Themis and WWF and Traffic, which primarily looked at the illegal wildlife trade, was an assessment on the scope, scale, and risk posed by the illegal wildlife trade, primarily between Africa and Southeast Asia. And what we recognised even at that stage was the issue was larger than just illegal wildlife trade on its own. And I'm sure we'll go into more detail on the scope and scale and seriousness of environmental crime later. But from our perspective, this evolution of the work developed by WWF and Themis, supported under the Climate Solutions Partnership, which is a collaboration between HSBC, the World Resources Institute, and WWF, it came about really from the fact that we needed to look more holistically across a range of commodities to explore that connection between deforestation and land conversion, and more broadly environmental crimes that could be linked back to financial institutions. And it's gone about it looking at both red flags, threat indicators, and risks connected with different types of environmental and financial crimes. And the ambition really around this is to strengthen financial institutions' screening capacity when reviewing existing clients, onboarding new ones, and assessing sectoral risks. And that very much builds on the Financial Action Task Force's incredibly important reports back in 2020 and 2021, which looked both at illegal wildlife trade and environmental crime under Marcus Plyer's tenure as president of the Financial Action Task Force. And so in summary, this work very much is informed by the recommendations that came out of those reports, and looking at how we can action those recommendations through this ambitious initiative.
Thank you, John, for your insight into the project. Olivia, the issue of land conversion is a significant one. Could you help our listeners understand why this topic is so crucial? Could you explain the issue of land conversion and its scale? Perhaps you could start us off by defining what land conversion actually is, as not all our listeners may be familiar with the term. Over to you, Olivia.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think I might leave John to talk about the scale and impacts of the issue, because as a WWF advocate, he's well placed to do that. But in terms of definitions, I think that's a really, really important thing to kind of start off with, because deforestation is a sort of a type of land conversion which I think probably a lot of people would have heard of, but you're right, land conversion is a slightly less commonly used term, and we talk about this as one of the kind of the main thrusts of our report, is really trying to get people to think more in terms of land conversion than purely deforestation, because deforestation is a subtype of land conversion. Land conversion is a kind of umbrella term that talks about, it refers to land use change. So that covers all sorts of ecosystems. It includes forest, but also grassland, marshland, peatland, savanna, mangrove swamps, any sort of biome that you can think of. And it also refers to, people think about deforestation in terms of forest loss and sort of land being cleared and then left sort of, in a state of kind of desertification, really. But if you think about land use change more widely, that's, you might remove 100 trees from kind of natural forests and you might plant 100 trees. But if those trees are part of a monoculture plantation, say something like soy or rubber or palm oil, you're not replacing like with like. There are the same number of trees on that piece of land, but they're not serving the same purpose. You've disrupted that natural biome, you've disrupted the biodiversity of that. So that's why we talk about kind of land conversion rather than just deforestation in this report. And I think just an example of why that's so important, I think a lot of people would have heard of deforestation in relation to the Amazon, but there are these other really, really important South American biomes. So the Brazilian Cerrado, for example, that covers about 20% of Brazil, and only about 20% of its original vegetation is actually still intact. And a lot of that is due to aggressive soy production and agriculture. And that is something I think most people listening to the podcast would have heard of the Amazon. I think probably fewer would have heard of the Cerrado, and a lot of that is because it just doesn't get the same amount of attention because it's not talked about in those terms of sort of deforestation. It's a more complex ecosystem. But actually, a lot of these areas are becoming what we sort of call the new kind of deforestation frontiers. So yeah, one of the main messages of this report is really that focusing purely on deforestation, you're actually missing a lot of other elements as well, and that's why we're asking people to think in terms of land conversion instead.
Thank you, Olivia. I agree with the understanding of land conversion as having impacts that are far-reaching and significant. John, could you perhaps elaborate on this? What are some of the specific impacts of land conversion that our listeners should be aware of, for example?
Thanks very much, Anya. So I think I'll cover three main connections really to respond to that question. So the first is very much around carbon sinks becoming carbon emitters. So to put in perspective, the connection between forests and climate change they're very much intertwined, and land use change, particularly driven by agriculture, is responsible between 12 to 20% of carbon emissions. And when we think of our ambitions relating to addressing climate change, forests and also savanna and other land use types are absolutely critical for our ambitions to meet those climate commitments. And a report from 2023 by the World Resources Institute and the University of Maryland reported that during 2023, people wiped out around 3.7 million hectares of primary tropical forest off the earth. So that 3.7 million hectares equates to roughly the size of Sweden and amounts to the loss of 10 football fields of old growth tropical forest every minute. So roughly by the time we've finished this recording, we'd be looking at a significant number of hectares that have been lost, equivalent to several hundred hectares. The second is relating to biodiversity loss, and there's a question there. What does that mean? And Olivia mentioned around the definitions, and really from our perspective at WWF, when we think of biodiversity, we think of not just the major species, but also more broadly wildlife in terms of flora and fauna. And in the last 50 years, we have lost 60% of the world's wildlife. And what is again becoming increasingly well understood is that connection between biodiversity and our lives as well. And whether that be around crop production, or whether that be around health, and also relating to resilience to the changing climate. our ability to coexist is very much connected to that biodiversity loss. And last but not least, relating to the defenders of the land in question that is often contested in parts of the world. And in 2022, almost half of the murders of environmental defenders were against people involved in the defence of land in deforestation and conversion hotspots. So it very much shows how this is not just, it can no longer just be looked at as a conservation issue. We must look at it through the lens of a economic, social, and also political issue. And more broadly, it underlines the urgency of our need to address this topic.
Thank you, John, for your valuable insights into those staggering impacts. Olivia, you have done extensive work on the intersection of land conversion and financial crime, both as part of this report and beyond. Can you share some of your insights on this topic with our listeners?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, firstly, it's important to say that land conversion itself can be legal or illegal. So if you think about this in very crude terms, legal would be you've got the right sort of permits and licenses for that activity, and if you haven't, then that renders that activity illegal. But there's actually, in reality, a lot of grey areas around this. There's a lot of jurisdictional variation between legislation and regulation on this issue, for one thing, also between different definitions. I think there are about 800 definitions of the term forest in use worldwide. So if there's that much variation on what the term forest means, there's obviously a lot of variation on what the term deforestation means as well. There's also a dearth of data really around sort of land conversion in a lot of these high risk areas of the world, that makes it very difficult to demarcate between legal and illegal activity. There's a lack of data transparency. There's a lack of clarity around land tenure as well, often in these areas. It's particularly in relation to Indigenous territories, which are often on high risk kind of forest dense land, and that means that actually any conversion activity that encroaches into those territories might not be designated as illicit. So there's a whole range of reasons why actually focusing on whether or not land conversion is legal is not really is a very simple way of looking at it, and because of all these grey areas, possibly not the best way of looking at it. Because there's also, regardless of whether or not it's legal or illegal, there's a very wide convergence with a range of other very serious crimes and some sort of seriously organised in nature as well. So, as John said, this obviously poses a very grave threat to local ecosystems, to the global ecosystem, but also it does to the global financial system, because that's how criminals are going to launder the proceeds of this crime. That's the system they're going to exploit. So what we show in this report is really that although many firms might already be risk assessing and sort of attempting to limit their exposure to land conversion related activity through an ESG lens and a reputational perspective, it actually represents a significant financial crime risk to firms as well. And we go into many of the different ways in which we see this convergence in the report. I won't go into all of them. I very much recommend, as one of the key authors of the report, that you do read this chapter. I think it's a really interesting one. But I think looking at land conversions through its association with drugs trafficking is a very, very interesting way of looking at it. So a lot of drugs cartels are increasingly diversifying their operations. So they're expanding their kind of illicit sort of products out from drugs, particularly into illicit gold and kind of illegal mining. So Colombia and Peru, these are actually the world's largest producers of cocaine. Interestingly, in these countries now, the value of illegal gold exports actually exceeds that of cocaine, really far outstrips it, which I think shows the extent of this increase in sort of diversification. And a lot of the world's most active organised crime groups are reportedly directly involved in the production and sale of illegal gold. So Mexico's Sinaloa cartel, very, very notorious. Brazilian and Russian syndicates, Chinese triads as well. These are all known, Italian kind of mafia groups. These are all known to be involved in illegal gold mining in South America, and that in order to kind of clear land for mining, that land conversion activity has to take place. You have to chop down trees and sort of strip the land if you want to mine it. So this drugs production kind of nexus directly and indirectly drives land conversion. It's what we talk about when we talk about narco deforestation. So there are some quite obvious ways in which this takes place. So there might be conversion of land into into sort of poppy plantations for kind of opium and heroin production in Mexico. So really converting land directly for the cultivation of drugs. Cannabis plantations in Madagascar is another one. In South and Central America, coca for cultivation of cocaine is a very obvious one. But there's also the associated infrastructure for this. So, these drugs traffickers are going to be wanting to, or they need to transport their drugs once they've cultivated them out of these kind of forest areas, these natural areas, to their demand markets. So they build makeshift ports, river ports, airstrips, roads to transport drugs. So they need to cut down trees and you can clear the land in order to kind of erect this infrastructure. And then the other aspect of it is the sort of the laundering aspect. So the reinvestment of drugs trafficking proceeds into legal or illegal land acquisition, the subsequent conversion of forest into agricultural land, particularly for soy and palm oil plantations. That's a really big one. These ostensibly licit activities which enable criminals to launder proceeds from drugs trafficking. You might have heard of blood avocados that Mexican cartels are involved in. Narco cattle ranching is another one, so the conversion of forest into pasture. So the whole array of these very sort of serious drugs trafficking activities which overlap with land conversion activity as well. And so the main message that we really convey in this report is that the convergence of this vast array of financial crimes, and there are so many other ones as well, I've really just focused on drugs trafficking here, and serious organised crime, is that actually firms should look beyond definitions of land conversion as legal or illegal. Especially this is very hard to do given local and national legislation and a variety of other factors that I mentioned. But actually, given so much of this activity takes place in the grey area between the two anyway, understanding that the threat of convergence with other financial crime and serious crime is really substantial regardless. And therefore, actually, given this extensive overlap, the presence of land conversion could be sort of in and of itself treated by firms as a red flag, a kind of a key indicator that there might be other serious financial and predicate crime involvement there as well.
Thank you for that, Olivia. John, that financial crime element mentioned by Olivia is a clear concern highlighted in our report and overall project. But why is it important for financial institutions? Why should they care?
Thanks, Anya. So to go back to what I was saying previously about the Financial Action Task Force reports, and also a report commissioned by the UN, I think back in 2022, the estimate is that environmental crime, which would include illegal logging, illegal mining, IUU fishing, and the illegal wildlife trade, is currently growing at between 5 to 7% annually. So to put in perspective, that is 2 to 3 times the current growth of the global economy. And so it was really through that framing that the questionnaire that was sent out and the research that was done to engage FIs was absolutely crucial. And the report surveyed 644 financial service professionals from across 17 countries. And the questions really dug into some of what are the organizational blockers, the awareness, the prioritization within the banks. And it very much aligned with the assessment given by the Financial Action Task Force that when they reviewed, I think, 22 countries, they found that over 50% did not have adequate country risk assessments or sectoral risk assessments. And that very much aligned to the findings from that questionnaire. But we really found that financial institutions were often unprepared to address these issues and to comply with the fast-changing due diligence, legislation and compliance landscape, including the EUDR and the upcoming forest law within the US. And over 60% of those respondents reported that a land conversion risk policy was either non-existent, so roughly 45%, or not yet developed in place, which equated to 18% of respondees. And really that gets to the sort of the core of the Environmental Crime Financial Toolkit and the initiative more broadly between WWF and Themis in terms of the solutions and the practical steps that can be taken by FIs. In addition to that, almost 50% of the financial institutions sampled are operating with or in high-risk sectors or areas, yet over a quarter were not undertaking specific related due diligence. And as Olivia's mentioned, the report does go into that detail to to really provide those case studies and examples of where fundamentally you see that convergence, and it does also clearly expose the risk this poses to financial institutions. Equally, we saw that between a fifth and a third of survey respondents also stated that their firms had borne witness to third parties attempting to hide financial crimes or unethical business practices linked to land conversion via different tactics. And what I would say around the sectoral risks and environmental crime more broadly is that the financial flows are significant. So an Interpol report has estimated that illegal logging globally on an annual basis is worth approximately $152 billion. So we're not talking about small transactions here. We're talking about significant illicit financial flows. But not obviously to frame this all negatively. I think one of the sort of positives that came from the questionnaire was that approximately 50% of financial institutions who responded to the questionnaire indicated a willingness to end business relationships on the strength of concerns around land conversion linked to financial crime. And this also suggests to us that recognizing and also separating the risk of exposure to financial crime through land conversion activity may be a key driver in reducing the financing of this harmful activity, because fundamentally at the moment the risk associated with these sectors is not indicative of the actual risk, and the case studies do show this, and that really just provides a sort of a top line summary of some of the findings, but within the report we do go into much more detail. So I would encourage anyone listening to at least read the exact summary, and if they have time to look at the main report, because the feedback we've had is that for the first time this report does actually bring together those that convergence piece in a way that hasn't been done before.
Thank you so much for that, John. Olivia, how might these financial institutions be exposed, and what are the risks to them?
Yeah, so in a very wide variety of ways, in short, both directly and indirectly through their supply chains, for example, through their kind of investments, and through things like sort of trade financing activity, through insurance of sort of shipments of commodities. So this report, we focus mainly on a couple of high risk commodities, so cattle, soy, palm oil, rubber, timber, coffee, cocoa, minerals, and oil and gas. So any sort of exposure, kind of involvement that financial institutions might have with any of those commodities does leave them exposed to this sort of these financial crimes that are related to land conversion. And I think that the risks for them are myriad, really, because there's a lot of increasing regulation around this. So the EUDR, the European Union Deforestation regulation, that's sort of coming in at the moment. That's a really big one. There's a lot of sort of transition risk involved with not being ready for regulation, for the sort of the legal risks that come from not from being exposed to these crimes, and also just from their sort of their standard sort of anti-money laundering and counter terrorist financing perspective. Given the convergence of financial crime that does overlap with land conversion activity. But I think what a really interesting one, and obviously reputational risk as well, ESG risk, a really, really interesting one that I think people don't think about so much, is this kind of physical risk or sort of supply chain risk, in terms of banks finance a whole load of companies, and the majority of companies around the world will in some way ultimately be reliant on nature for their business, whether that's because they deal in these sort of natural commodities, or further down their supply chains. A huge amount of stuff comes from nature, with sort of ecosystem services that we talk about in the report. And if you are financing activity that's basically degrading that natural capital, that resource, then you're kind of shooting yourself in the foot further down the line, because you're reducing the ability of all the businesses that you're financing to actually generate, to generate kind of profit longer term, and to sort of make materials and kind of business and revenue from this natural capital, if actually what you're doing is just eroding it. So I think that's a really interesting angle to consider as well, that actually if you're a financial institution, you're caring more about safeguarding nature, you're sort of in a way indirectly safeguarding your own future income as well.
Thank you for that, Olivia. Moving on, a key finding from the survey we conducted was the pinpointing of high-risk trade routes that have been identified by financial services professionals. John, what does this mean, and can you give us some examples? How can our research help financial institutions in the different intersections and regions?
Thanks, Anya. So I think one of the key findings, and subsequently through the workshops and the one-to-one sessions we've held with financial institutions, has shown is we're very much talking about global commodity supply chains and also global trade routes. And quite a few things have changed, but certain things haven't. So over 90% of global trade is still conducted via ship. And with that in mind, there are particular trade routes that are significant in terms of thinking about the key producer regions for particular forest risk commodities, whether that be soy, beef or palm oil. And although it's slightly more diversified when we think of something like tropical timber, the supply chains and the supply routes are very well established. And Olivia touched on this point in terms of trade finance and the exposure for banks, but ultimately at the moment, often the blank spot is ultimately that question relating to trade routes, and potential risk of that trade route is often just not being asked, or is not a part of the due diligence or KYC process. And so I think for us, it was that finding and the fact that the geographical importance of that particular trade financing is not made a requirement to look at in more detail, or it does not cover or carry a risk weighting, it was one of the real sort of action points for us, and where we feel that this initiative that we're co-leading with Themis can really have an impact, because fundamentally by being able to overlap those high risk trade routes and be able to provide the typologies that can indicate additional risk, whether that be through transit ports, whether that be through a particular producer country, it would require not to rule out that the trade can be seen as legal and ultimately above board, but to require additional questions and require additional due diligence. And I think this is a key point of the wider work as well, is it's ultimately being part of the work is about raising the awareness and bringing FIs and the risk and compliance teams with us on on that sort of journey to be able to identify where those potential risks sit, because the questionnaire pointed to us at the moment that geographically there are still blind spots, and those blind spots are built out in the case studies within the report that identify that there is significant risk. It's just currently not being integrated into those assessments, often by financial institutions, but also by regulators as well.
Thank you for that, John. Now, as a final question to you, do you have any parting words or messages for us? What are the key takeaways listeners should glean from this podcast and overall issue of deforestation and land conversion?
So that's a big one. I think what I would say around this, if there are any financial institution sort of stakeholders listening to this, I would firstly say that there is a movement with the work we're doing and with other coalitions built around the illegal wildlife trade as well, where fundamentally we are developing solutions and practical solutions to some of these issues. And I would also go as far to say that financial institutions have an absolutely critical role to play, and that is very much around reading the report and understanding where within your financial institution that risk may sit, whether that be direct risk, secondary risk, correspondent banking risk, or USD clearing risk. But from an analysis that's been done, I think, by Global Canopy, financial institutions have given approximately $6.1 trillion worth of financing to the 350 companies most exposed to deforestation and land conversion. So it's not necessarily about removing that financing completely, but by integrating stronger risk and compliance protocols, and ultimately very much prioritizing this, financial institutions can play an absolutely critical role in addressing this emergent issue, which will ultimately have a net benefit, positive effect economically, politically, and also socially, as well as environmentally.
I'm just going to jump in there and give my own final thoughts as well. Just to pick up on what John said about the kind of exposure to crimes as well, and not just being about removing that financing. That if you think about, as I mentioned earlier, if you think about land conversion as a sort of indicator in and of itself of potential kind of convergence with other financial crimes and predicate crimes. I mean, for example, it's thought that about 40% of deforestation is undertaken by victims of kind of human trafficking and forced labour. If you think about it that way, that actually, looking for trying to sort of detect and disrupt, but kind of screening for land conversion is actually a really, really good way of safeguarding your business against other financial crimes, and of being able to do, good from your sort of ESG agenda as well, but try and think of it as like another thing in your arsenal to help you with that sort of compliance. If you don't think about it in terms of trying to sort of safeguard nature, then think about it in that way as well.
Thank you both for your insights, and especially thank you both for coming today. I really enjoyed speaking with you both, and the discussion has been very insightful on a very crucial topic relevant to all listeners from all sectors. Please check out the report Financial Crimes and Land Conversion, Uncovering the Risk for Financial Institutions, available on both Themis and WWF websites.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of Themis Podcasts. We hope you enjoyed it. If you'd like to find out more about Themis, please do contact us via our website at wearethemis.com or drop us an email at info@wearethemis.com. Thank you.